We're on Daf Tzadi Vav, 9 lines down from the bottom, from 9 lines down from the top. Boy Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera posed the following suffix. Emure Pesach b'Mitzrayim hecha akterinu. We know that every korban Pesach, like all korbanos, has a murim, and those are burnt on the Mizbeach. But with regard to Pesach Mitzrayim, there was no Mizbeach. So how did they do the Haktorah of the Murim at the time of Yitzias Mitzrayim? And Amalei Abaye responds to Rabbi Zera, Uman lemelon delo shviski ovud. How do you know that they didn't take a spit, a shipud, and roast the korban Pesach, and they ate it? They ate it whole. In other words, that with regard to the korban Pesach in Mitzrayim, since there was no possibility of Haktor al Gabi Mizbeach, what they did was they took the entire Pesach, including the Emurim, and they roasted it and ate it. In other words, when there's no possibility of Achilas Mizbeach, then the Achilas Adam will replace the Achilas Mizbeach. And furthermore, the Od Hatana, we have a brisa of Rabbi Yosef, Shlosha Mizbachos Hayusham. There were 3 Mizbachos in Mitzrayim for Hazas Hadam. As it says in the Pasuk in Shmos Yud Beis, Al HaMashkof Ve'al Shtei HaMezuzos, that the dam was sprinkled on the mashkof and on the 2 mezuzos. You see that the mashkof was 1 mizbeach, the Shtei mezuzos were another 2 mizbachos. V'su midi achrini lo hava. There was no other mizbeach, and therefore we see clearly that in the absence of mizbeach, Baktar Simurim, there's no other choice to assume that they ate the entire Pesach, even the Murim, which was solely in a shipud. And that's how Rabbeinu Chanana learns this sugya. However, the Meiri reinterprets Abaye, and he thinks that there was a tzliya on the shipud, l'shem gavoa. In other words, they actually burnt that part of the korban, which was a murim, and it was l'shem gavoa. It wasn't that they ate that part, but that they burnt it, and that sreifa was some sort of a kiyum of the sreifa l'aktar of a murim. And this leads us to the Mishnah here on Daf Tzadi Vav. The Mishnah is going to address the question of the contrast between Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Ludoros. Which halachos and which requirements applied during that Pesach of Yitzias Mitzrayim, when they ate the Pesach that night and the next day, as opposed, in contrast, to Pesach Ludoros for all generations. Ma bein Pesach Mitzrayim lePesach Hadoros. Number 1, Pesach Mitzrayim mikcho mi be'asar. They were commanded to take the korban Pesach, designated from the 10th of Nisan. And that's based on the pasuk in Parshas Bo, Dabru el kol adas Yisrael lemar, be'asar lachodesh hazeh v'yikchu lahem ish sela be'savos selabos labayis. And it means, says the Meiri, that they shouldn't have designated it before the 10th, nor after the 10th. Others interpret it that they shouldn't take it before that date, but they could take it later than that date. He quotes here the Mechilta, Gam liachar mikan kosher, they take it a little bit later, but they shouldn't be makdim l'kichaso earlier than the Asiri, than the 10th of Nisan. And this is something that's unique to Pesach Mitzrayim. With regard to Pesach L'Doros, the Gemara is going to derive from a mute in the pasuk. There's no requirement at all of designating the Pesach 4 days in advance. whenever you designate the Pesach, that's fine. Number two, another unique feature with regard to Pesach Mitzrayim, Viton Hazah Biagudas Ezov. They had to take an Agudat Ezov, which is a kind of a shrub, and they had to be tovel it in the dam and use it for Hazah. And where was the Hazah? This is something that we indicated earlier. Ala Mashkof V'al Shtei Mezuzos. Number three, so that halacha of Hazah and Tvila of Agudas Ezov and the Dam, that doesn't apply Lidoros. Three, the Nechal B'chipazon, the Torah commands the Yotzei Mitzrayim that when they eat the Pesach, they have to eat it very quickly. And that's something that's unique to Pesach Mitzrayim, does not apply Lidoros. We could take our time eating the Korban Pesach. And furthermore, the fourth distinction that sets Pesach Mitzrayim as unique is B'layla Echad U Pesach Doros Noe Kol Shiva. As far as Pesach Mitzrayim is concerned, it was only one night. Pesach Doros was all Shiva. So the Gemara is going to have to explain this part of the Mishnah. At the face of it, it makes no sense. Now let's just quote the pasuk in Ulekachtem Agudas Ezov v'tavaltem badam asher basaf v'hagosam el amashkov v'el shtei mezuzos min adam asher basaf. So with regard to Pesach L'Doros, we makabel the dam in a bozech, and we do this week on the Mizbeach. And that's a mission that we had back on Daf Samach Daled. But with regard to the Pesach Mitzrayim, the Torah says L'kachtem Aguzas Ezov v'tavaltem badam, and then they had to do a hazah on the mashkov and the shtei mezuzos. And this leads us to the Gemara here on Daf Tzadivav. Minolan, how do we know that this requirement that on the 10th of Nisan, the Yotzei Mitzrayim were required to designate a Korban Pesach? How do we know that 4-day in advance designation doesn't apply for all Doros? What's the source for the din of the Mishnah to differentiate and contrast between Pesach L'Doros and Pesach Mitzrayim with regard to this halacha of Asar L'Chodesh on the 10th of Nisan? The Gemara answers the Chsiv, Dabru al kol adas Yisrael lemar, the Asar L'Chodesh hazeh, let's emphasize the word hazeh, v'yikhulem ish l'sel b'eisavos alabayis. And the word hazeh is redundant. Zeh, it's a miut. Zeh, Pesach Mitzrayim, mekho be'esor. You have to buy it and designate it on the 10th of Nisan, 4 days before the Shechita of the Pesach. But v'yein Pesach L'Doros, mekho be'esor. Pesach, as far as all generations are concerned, you can take it anytime you want. Now, what we should keep in mind as we move forward through this sugya is that we're darshaning the word hazeh as a miut. The Gemara now asks a question about this yalfusa for the word hazeh, elamei ata, if you're going to derive it in that way, that hazeh is coming to exclude Pesach L'Doros. Well, let's take a look at another pasuk in Parshas Bo with regard to Pesach Mitzrayim. And there too, the pasuk has the extra word hazeh. Now, what is this pasuk teaching us? This is the source for what's called Bedikas HaPesach. We need to examine the Pesach, the lamb, for 4 days before the time of its shechita to make sure that there's no mum. Is Hachinami, you're going to say that since it says the word Hazeh in this pasuk, regard to Bedika, that time Bikur, the word bedika is in the Gemara's language called bikur. Bikur means levaker, to do a very careful discernment and make sure, guarantee for 4 days that the Pesach has no mum. Are we saying that only applies to Pesach Mitzrayim? And it doesn't apply to Pesach L'Doros? For Asanya, we have a brisa, Ben Bagbag Omer, Minay L'Tamid. Now, from the fact that the Ben Bagbag takes this halacha, which we see in the parsha of Pesach Mitzrayim, and he expands it and derives from it other karbonos. In this case, the carbon tamid. Now, which halacha was spelled out in the parsha of Pesach Mitzrayim was the halacha of bikur. Bikur means that for 4 days after you designate the lamb, you have to examine the lamb every day to make sure that there was no mu. And therefore, once you guarantee that there's no blemish, it's a tamim, then and only then are you makriv the carbon. Now, the word hazeh appears in that parsha, where it says in Parshas Bo, ad arba'asar yom lachodesh hazeh. The word mishmeres means that you should check out the seh on a daily basis from 4 days before the shechita, every day during those 4 days. And yet it says hazeh. But Ben Bagbag says, minayin l'tamid. We're talking about a carbon tamid. That's not a carbon pesach. Sheton bikar abba yomim kodem shechita. For 4 days, you have to check out this lamb before you bring it as a carbon. 4 days later, as the tamid of that day, you have to check it out on over and over again during a 4-day period. That's called bikur. And he derives it from the parsha of tamid. Shenemar, in Perek Ches of Sefer Bamidbar, it says, "Es karbani lachmi lishai rechni chochi tishmeru lakriv li b'moado." And the Torah used the word shmira and tishmeru with regard to the carbon tamid. Ulahalanu omer, with regard to Pesach Mitzrayim in Parshas Bo, v'yolachem l'shmeres adar basar. And we see the word mishmeres again. Malahalan, just like in the case of Pesach Mitzrayim, where it says the mishmeres is ton bikur arba yom kom shchita, afkan ton bikur arba yom kom shchita. Now, it means that the carbon tamid lidoros requires bikur of 4 days. And if that be the case, then the word hazeh, which appears in the parsha of Pesach Mitzrayim, is not excluding other karbonos. Ben Bagbag says the halach, the requirement of bikur for 4 days, applies to a tamid, and the carbon pesach should be lidoros. Should be no different than the tamid. And basically, we've derived a fundamental principle in all kachim, in all zvachim, that we need bikur for 4 days before we bring the carbon for the shechita. So you see that the word azeh is not coming to exclude pesach lidoros. So Gemara says, Shani Hasam, you're right. If we only had the word azeh, we would limit this halachic requirement of bikur for 4 days to Pesach Mitzrayim. However, here it's different. When you talk about the law of bikur, we have something that goes against the word hazeh. Ichsiv, as it says, tishmeru. Now, the word tishmeru in the parsha of Tamid is used as Gzeira Shava to Pesach Mitzrayim, where it also says the word Limishmeres. And Pesach Lidoros Nami, the same halacha of Bikur as a requirement of 4 days of examining the animal is going to apply to Pesach Lidoros, Tichsiv, as it says. Now, this is one chapter further in Bo. We've been learning Bo, Perek Yud Beis. Now we're in Perek Yud Gimel, and it says there, "V'hoyaki v'yacho Hashem el eretz haknani v'avadeta es havoda zos b'chodesh hazeh." Now, to appreciate this entire sugya that we're learning today, it's critical that we underline this pasuk. This pasuk is going to come up over and over and over again. Now, what is this pasuk telling me? Va'avadeta es havoda zos b'chodesh hazeh. The pasuk is completely superfluous. We've already been given the mitzvah of Korban Pesach. Why did the Torah go ahead and say you should do this avodah in this month? And we derive from this, Shiu kol avodos chodesh zeh kozeh, that for Doros, every Nisan, we should do the avodos that we did with regard to Pesach Mitzrayim. So that's the chodesh zeh kozeh, meaning Ludoros ke Pesach Mitzrayim. And therefore, since the Pesach Mitzrayim, the Torah spells out that you require bikur of 4 days, the same halacha applies with regard to Pesach Ludoros. But Enochinami, it's true, if not for this special pasuk of the Avadita, from which we derive this conclusion, then the word Hazeh, in and of itself, as an extra word, would have excluded Pesach Ludoros and told me to limit this halacha to Pesach Mitzrayim. Nu elahu hazeh limaute mai. Okay, I added a few words there, meaning what do you do with the word hazeh? We know that the word hazeh is redundant, and in the parsha of Bikur, we know from Ben Bagbag that the requirement of Bikur applies for Pesach Ludoros. So why did the Torah add this superfluous word hazeh? Limaute Pesach Sheni dekavaseh. Pesach Sheni, in a sense, is very, very similar to Pesach Mitzrayim, because Pesach Sheni doesn't have a holiday of 7 days. It's a one-day business. Just on that day, you bring the Korban Pesach. And that's very similar to Pesach Mitzrayim. And now we're saying that the Torah added the word Hazeh with regard to Bikur of Pesach Mitzrayim to exclude the requirement of Bikur with regard to Pesach Sheni. Now, of course, you might want to know, as the Rashba asks, I mean, Pesach Sheni is also included in the Pasuk V'Avadita, which equates Pesach Mitzrayim with Pesach Ludoros. But in any event, once we have this extra word Hazeh, it's coming to tell you that this requirement doesn't apply. Now, again, what we would have to study in a more of an in-depth shir is to figure out why this requirement of Bikur was lifted with regard to Pesach Sheni. But the Gemara now asks, Elameata, if you're telling me that the word Hazeh, unless I know otherwise, is coming to exclude Pesach Ludoros, is let's take a look at the word Hazeh in another context within Pesach Mitzrayim. It says with regard to Pesach Mitzrayim, V'achluas habasar b'layla hazeh. And if the word Hazeh is coming to exclude Pesach Ludoros, then what does that mean? That Pesach Ludoros doesn't require eating the meat of the Pesach b'layla hazeh. Hachinami dezeh, meaning Pesach Mitzrayim, nechal b'layla. V'yein acher nechal b'layla, which would mean that Pesach Ludoros you could eat during the day. You don't have to eat it at night. The Gemara answers that the din of Pesach Ludoros, that it could be only eaten by night, is derived from the pasuk. Again, as I told you to underline it, because we're going to have it over and over again. Amar krav yavadatem es avadates avodas osa b'chodesh hazeh, which equates all the avodas of this month for all generations, and therefore we require that you eat the Pesach at night, and you don't have a possibility of eating it during the day. But then again, you've started with the premise that the word Hazeh is redundant and it comes to exclude Pesach Ludoros. If it's not here, as far as Laila Hazeh, excluding Pesach Ludoros, so what do you do with the extra word Hazeh? Ella Hazeh Lamali, why do we need the extra word Hazeh? Look at Rabbi Elazar, Ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva. And this is sugi in 2 places. It's at the end of Masechet Pesachim and it's at the beginning of Masechet Brachos. And Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah, Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah and Rabbi Akiva have a major machlokas about when is the latest time to eat the Korban Pesach on the night of the 15th. According to Rabbi Lezer, it's up till midnight, chatzos, and according to the Chacham, it's the entire night. And each one derives his halacha, respectively, from this word hazeh. Elameata, if you're telling me again that Hazeh is coming to exclude Pesach Ludoros, and that's why we said there was no requirement of designating the Pesach on Ludoros on the 10th of Nisan, it's Elameata. What are you going to do with this one? V'chol orel lo yochal bo. Now it's interesting, the Gemara is making a little bit of a leap of faith, and it's saying that just like you dash the word hazeh as a mute, and whenever you see that word hazeh in the context of Pesach Mitzrayim, you always exclude Pesach Doros. If I have another redundant word in the parsha of Pesach Mitzrayim, it doesn't have to be the word hazeh, it could be the word bo, then that's going to exclude Pesach Doros. And it says, Kol Ora Lo Yochel Bo. Bo is an extra word. Is hachinami, should we assume that dafka bo eno ochel, the oral is excluded from eating Pesach Mitzrayim, but aval ochel bePesach ledoros, that for all generations we can invite the oral to participate in the achila of the Korban Pesach? We know that's not true. We had Mishnayos about that. Again, we come back to that same pasuk, which teaches me that all the requirements that apply to Pesach Rishon, Pesach Rishon, I mean to say to Pesach Mitzrayim, apply to Pesach L'Doros, including this prohibition in terms of an Aron. So Elabo Lomali. So why did the Torah say Kol Orel Lo Yochal Bo? There's an extra word Bo, and the Gemara answers Bo Eno Ochel Avul Ochel BeMatzah Umor. Even though the Torah says that you eat the Korban Pesach together with Matzah Umor, so Matzah Umor is an addendum to Korban Pesach. And now we're saying that an Orel is excluded from the Pesach. It's Memela, I would think he's also excluded from Matzah Umor, which are extensions of Pesach. They are eaten as an accompaniment to the Pesach. No. Mashmalan, the word Bo, it means that as far as the Korban Pesach is concerned, we exclude the Orel, but as far as Matzah Umor, he's not excluded. Elameato, again, the same kind of structure. In the parasha of Pesach Mitzrayim, it says, Zoch Suchas of Pesach, Kol Ben Nechar. Lo Yochal Bo Ben Nechar means a mumar, someone who rebels against the Torah, rejects the Torah. And again, the word bo is an extra word. It's Hachinami, Bo Eno Ochel Aval Ochelu Pesach L'Doros. That for all generations, the Korban Pesach will be eaten even by someone who is a Ben Nechar, is a mumar. We know that that's not so. A mumar is excluded from the Korban Pesach. On my cross, again, V'avadita, teaching me an equation, analogy between Pesach L'Doros and Pesach Mitzrayim. So why did the Torah have to add in the parasha of Ben Nechar, which we said was a mumar, the extra word bo? And the Gemara answers, bo hamoras das poseles, v'yein hamoras das poseles b'truma. Amoras das is a mumar, and Chas Shalom, he may have accepted upon himself another religion. He was baptized, I don't know what, and he's allowed, if he's a Kohen, to eat truma. And we know this from the word bo. The extra word bo as a miyut is coming to limit the psul of mumar to the karban, but it doesn't apply to truma. Truma doesn't have the same kedusha as the karban. Now here you should know that there's a major issue with the word truma here, because the Gemara in Yevamis has the word maser instead of truma. And actually the Meiri and even the Rambam paskin that a mumar is not allowed to, he's enjoined from eating truma. He's allowed to eat maser because maser doesn't have the kedusha, it's chulin of truma. But in any event, our girsa has the word truma. We have to understand why a ben nechar is allowed to eat truma. Now the Gemara says, you know what? I don't understand. We have both the psul of Arel that we saw in the Torah and the psul of Mumar that's spelled out in the Torah. Why did the Torah feel compelled to give us both? Itzrich lemichtav Arel, v'itzrich lemichtav ben nechar. We need both. The ikas of Rachmana Orel, if the Torah had only mentioned that an Orel is excluded from the Korban Pesach, that's because Mishum Demois, his goof is repulsive. He's got Orelus, and therefore he cannot eat from the Pesach. Aval ben Nechar, at least physically, he's got a Mila. He's Ein Gufo Mos. Aim, I would have thought, low, he's not possible from eating the Korban Pesach. Tzricha. And on the other side, V'yashmin ben Nechar, I would have said that there's a reason why Ben Nechar specifically is excluded from Achilas HaPesach Mishum, the Ein Libo LaShamayim. He doesn't have any Kavanah L'Shem Shamayim. He's a Mumar. Aval Orel to Libo LaShamayim. I mean, again, he's an Orel. Well, I don't respect him for being an Orel, but on the other hand, he's not rebelling against God. He can still have L'Shem Shamayim. His Emolo, maybe I would think he's allowed to eat the Korban Pesach Tzrich. Now we get back on the track. If the word Hazeh is extra to exclude Pesach Lidoros, then Elamei Ata, in Pesach Mitzrayim, in Bo, it says, Toshav Asachir Lo Yochal Bo. Now, Toshav is a Ger Toshav, and he doesn't have the status of a Jew because he's only chayav in 7 mitzvahs. And then it says Sachir is a reference to a guy who is an idol worshiper. Neither of these should eat from the Korban Pesach. They're possible, they're excluded. It's Hachinami. Are you going to take the word bo, and whenever you see an extra word in the pasuk, it's coming as a miyud to exclude Pesach L'Doros, is therefore bo only with regard to Pesach Mitzrayim, hu dieno ochel, then we exclude a ger toshav or a nochri that's oved avodah zara. However, ochel hu Pesach Lidoros. And this can't be. It's not possible to assume that a goy or a ger toshav can eat Pesach Lidoros. On Makra, again, we come back to the Avadata, and that was, if you remember, the pasuk that equated Pesach L'Shah, meaning Pesach Mitzrayim with Pesach Lidoros, Ela Bo Lamali. So what are we going to do with the extra word bo? So the Gemara says bo is with regard to Pesach, Amoras das poselas. Ve'en amoras das poselas b'truma. Once again, the Gemara's pattern is that since truma doesn't have the same level of kedusha as a carbon, therefore mumar, or the other cases that we had of a nochri shavad avodas kochavim, these are excluded from the achila of the carbon. And the Torah says both to tell you that they are not excluded from the achila of truma. Elameata, if the word hazeh excludes Pesach Lidoros, well, guess what? In the parsha of Pesach Mitzrayim, it says umalto kol eved each miknas kesef umalto so oz yochal bo, which means that if a person owns an eved knani, and this eved knani is an orel, he was never subjected to milah, then his master is not allowed to eat Korban Pesach because that's the obligation the Torah generates or imposes an obligation on the shoulders of an Adon who owns an Eved Knani to make sure that his Eved Knani is circumcised. And if he doesn't fulfill that obligation, the Adon is excluded from Korban Pesach. Is Hachinami. Here also the extra word bo. Is bo eno ochel aval ochel Pesach Lidoros? That's not true. That can't be. We can't invite an Eved to eat the Korban Pesach. So the Gemara says, "Hamakra v'avadata." We could have already anticipated the text that the word v'avadata sets up and teaches an equation between Pesach and each Pesach. Ela bo lamali. So why in the parsha of Milah does the Torah add the word bo? It says umalto so oz yochal bo. What is the bo coming to exclude? And the Gemara answers, Milas Zecharav Va'avadav Ma'keves. The ain Milas Zecharav Va'avadav Ma'keves B'truma. Again, setting up a contrast between Pesach on the one hand as Kodshim and as a Zevah, and Truma on the other hand, which has Kedusha, but not the level of Kedushas Mizbeach. It's Kedushas Gvulin, it's outside the Mizbeach. There, we don't exclude a person who has an Eved or a son who is not Gemalt. Elameato Dechsiv, in Pesach Mitzvah, it says, the Etzem Lo Sishbru Bo. Again, the extra word bo is hachinami bo eno shover aval shover pesach l'doros. How could that be? That pesach l'doros, you're allowed to break the bone. We know that you're not allowed to break the bone of the pesach. Here, Tosfos asks a kasha. The Torah itself in the parsha of Pesach Sheni Valoscha says etzem lo sishbru bo. So we know that Pesach Sheni is included in this avera of trias etzem. So how could the Gemara raise a hava mina that Korban Pesach itself, Pesach Rishon, would not be included in this Isur? So the Gemara says that Omakra Biavadata. And again, Biavadata sets up the equation with Pesach Mitzrayim. Elabo Lomali. So why did the Torah add the word bo in the parsha of Etzem Lo Sishbru? Bo bekosher velo bepas. So this piece of Gemara here that I just read, I don't understand. There seems to be a havamina that there would be an Isur of Shviras Etzem in a Korban Pesach that's possible. I can't fathom that. But in any event, as I state, the Gemara says that I need the word bo to teach me that if the Korban Pesach became possible, there's no Isur of Etzem Lo Sishbru. Elamiata, again, if you're darshaning the extra word in a parsha of Pesach Mitzrayim to exclude Pesach L'Doros, the Chsiv al tochlu menu na, right? You're not allowed to eat from the Korban Pesach if it's half cooked, if it's not totally cooked. So now we're going to say that the word mimenu is extra. Could have said al tochlu na. What is the word mimenu teaching me? Mimenu iyata ochel avata ochel na bePesach Doros. We know that we're enjoined from eating a Korban Pesach that's not fully cooked, not fully roasted. Once again, Omer Krav Yavadata. Nu ela mimenu lomali. What do we do with the extra word mimenu? Lichid Rabba Omer Rabbi Yitzchak, a gzera shava that was presented by Rabba in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak, and from that gzera shava he derived the conclusion that just like an orel is osur b'achilas Pesach, he's also osur in achilas mas. Now we go back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that one of the unique halachos that apply to Pesach Mitzrayim as opposed to Pesach L'Doros is nechal b'chi pazon, min nolan. How do we know, asks the Gemara, that Pesach L'Doros does not require b'chi pazon? If Pesach Mitzrayim requires b'chi pazon, so too Pesach L'Doros. And the Gemara answers the Omer Kra in Pesach Mitzrayim. It says v'achaltem oso b'chi pazon. And now we have the extra word oso. Oso nechal b'chi pazon v'ein acher nechal b'chi pazon. That a Korban Pesach L'Doros does not have this requirement of b'chi pazon.